Let me guess. You check your bank balance before you check your phone in the morning. You felt your stomach drop the second a card reader takes just a little too long to approve. You said the words, "I don't do debt" out loud, almost proudly, as if refusing a loan was the same thing as winning. And somewhere along the way, without ever noticing it happen, you started believing something that sounds responsible but is quietly keeping you exactly where you are. If you just avoid every dollar you don't already own, you'll finally be safe. Here's what nobody ever sat you down and told you. You were taught to fear a weapon, not a knife, not a gun, something quieter, something that walks into your life wearing the mask of a bank statement, a monthly payment, a red number on a screen. You were taught that debt is the enemy. You were taught that the poor stay poor because they borrow, and the rich stay rich because they don't. That is a lie. Machiavelli warned about this kind of thinking centuries ago. He said men are rarely destroyed by the danger standing in front of them. They're destroyed by the fear planted inside them long before any real danger ever arrives. Money works exactly the same way. That fear was never installed to protect you. It was installed to contain you. Here's the truth they don't want you sitting with. The wealthy do not avoid debt. The wealthy weaponize it. They borrow more than you will ever borrow in your life. And they sleep better than you do while doing it. Meanwhile, you are told to fear a credit card, to fear a loan, to fear the very tool that could pull you out of the exact hole you are standing in. Ask yourself something honest right now. Who benefits when you are terrified of debt? Not you. You stay small. You stay cautious. You stay employable, predictable, and grateful for scraps. Sit with that for a moment, because everything that follows depends on you being willing to burn down a belief you have carried since childhood. I already know what some of you are thinking. You are thinking of a cousin, a neighbor, a headline about someone who borrowed carelessly and lost everything. Hold on to that story. Do not discard it, because by the end of this, you will understand exactly why that story happened, and exactly why it has nothing to do with the strategy one I'm about to give you. The failure you are picturing was never caused by debt itself. It was caused by the absence of a plan wrapped around it. A knife in careless hands cuts the wrong person. The same knife in a surgeon's hands saves a life. Nobody blames the metal. This is not a lecture about recklessness. Recklessness will ruin you exactly as fast with debt as it will without it. This is a lecture about precision, about the difference between borrowing out of desperation and borrowing out of calculation, a difference so profound it explains almost the entire gap between a family that stays working class for 3 generations and the family that builds something that outlives them. Let's begin with a picture. 2 men, same city, same year, same starting income. Call them nothing more than that. The first man, the second man. Names don't matter here. Only decisions matter. The first man was taught the popular gospel. Debt is dangerous. Avoid it at all costs. Pay cash. Live within your means. Sleep soundly knowing you owe nobody anything. So he did exactly that. He saved slowly. He avoided loans. He avoided investment because investment often requires borrowed capital, and borrowed capital terrified him. He was, by every conventional measure, responsible. The second man was taught something else, something older, something colder. He was taught that money itself is neutral, that debt is not moral or immoral. It is a tool like fire, used with discipline. It builds empires, used with recklessness. It burns down villages. He didn't fear the tool. He studied it. 10 years later, the first man is still renting the same modest life, proud of his zero balance, unaware that his caution cost him a decade of leverage. The second man owns 3 properties, none of them paid for in cash, all of them purchased using capital that was never his to begin with, all of them now worth far more than what he borrowed. He didn't get rich by avoiding risk. He got rich by understanding it better than the system expected him to. This is the part nobody tells you. Poverty is not caused by too much debt. Poverty is caused by uninformed debt. Consumer debt taken to buy things that lose value the moment you own them. A car you can't afford. A vacation you can't repeat. A lifestyle you perform for people who don't even notice. Wealth is built on a completely different species of debt. Debt used to acquire assets. Debt used to buy time. Debt used to control resources larger than your own savings could ever purchase alone. Machiavelli understood something about power that applies perfectly here. He knew that a prince who relies only on his own soldiers is weak, because his strength is capped by what he alone can gather. But a prince who can command the soldiers of others, who can borrow strength, multiplies his power beyond his own resources. This is exactly what leverage means in the language of money. You are not just using your own strength. You are commanding capital that belongs to someone else and making it work for your future. The poor are taught to fear this. Why? Because a population that fears debt will never use leverage. A population that never uses leverage will never own appreciating assets at scale. A population that never owns assets at scale will always work for those who do. Fear in this equation is not protection. Fear is a fence built quietly around a very tool that could set you free. Look closer at history, and the pattern repeats with almost mechanical precision. Empires were not built by kings who waited until their own treasury could fund every campaign. Empires were built by rulers who understood credit, who understood alliance, who understood that borrowed strength deployed at the right moment could conquer more territory than a decade of patient saving ever could. Machiavelli called this the difference between a prince who depends on fortune alone and a prince who possesses what he named or two, the personal capacity to seize what fortune only makes available for a moment. The same logic that built kingdoms builds portfolios. The same principle that expanded borders expands net worth. Nothing about this changed when gold became currency and currency became credit. Only the costume changed. The mechanism stayed exactly the same. And here is the part that should genuinely unsettle you. The institutions that profit from lending are not naive. They study risk with a precision most borrowers never bother to match. When a bank extends a mortgage on income-producing property, it is not gambling. It has run the numbers. It knows the statistical likelihood of that asset generating enough return to make the loan profitable for everyone involved, lender and borrower alike. The wealthy did not stumble into this arrangement by luck. They learned to read the same numbers the banks already knew, and they stopped being afraid of a system that was, in truth, built to reward calculated confidence far more often than it punishes it. Meanwhile, the average person interacts with debt only through its most primitive form. A payment plan for a phone that will be obsolete in 2 years. A finance sofa. A holiday charged to a card with no plan beyond hope. This is not the same conversation as a commercial loan against a cash-flowing property. Yet both get filed under the same terrifying word, debt, and both get treated with the same blanket suspicion. This conflation is not an accident of language. It is a failure of education, one that keeps entire generations circling the same modest plateau while a small number of people, taught the actual mechanics, climb past them entirely. Lesson 1. There are 2 debts, not one. Most people have never been taught to separate debt into categories. To them, all debt is the same monster, wearing different masks. This is the first illusion you must destroy. There is consumption debt, money borrowed to acquire something that depreciates, something that provides temporary comfort and then vanishes, leaving only the payment behind. A finance television, a car loan on a vehicle that loses a third of its value the moment it leaves a lot. A credit card balance built on dinners nobody remembers a month later. Then there is production debt, money borrowed to acquire something that appreciates or generates income, a property that rises in value while tenants pay down your loan for you, a business loan that funds equipment producing revenue greater than the monthly repayment, an education loan, when chosen with brutal precision, that unlocks an income bracket permanently out of reach without it. The poor are taught to fear both equally. The wealthy learn to fear only one. The single distinction, understood early, changes the entire trajectory of a life. 2 people can carry the exact same total debt on paper and live in entirely different financial universes, because one of them is drowning in liabilities disguised as lifestyle, and the other is standing on a foundation of assets disguised as risk. Lesson 2. Fear is a product sold to keep you small. Somebody profits from your fear of debt. Understand this clearly. It is not an accident that financial caution is marketed to the poor with more intensity than to the rich. A frightened population does not compete for capital. A frightened population does not bid on property. A frightened population does not start businesses that might one day challenge existing power. Machiavelli warned that a ruler must sometimes appear one way while operating another. that the appearance of virtue and the practice of power are rarely the same performance. The financial system does exactly this. It appears to protect you from debt through warnings and slogans, while it quietly extends enormous credit lines to those already positioned to use it well. The wealthy are offered lower interest rates, longer terms, and more favorable structures, precisely because the system trusts them to use debt as a weapon rather than a wound. Meanwhile, you are handed a warning label and told to be responsible, which in practice means being told to stay away from the exact instrument that could change your position in the game. Ask yourself honestly, has fear of debt ever made you wealthier? Or has it simply made you cautious, obedient, and permanently one step behind those who were never afraid to begin with? Lesson 3. Discipline is the price of admission. Here is where most people disqualify themselves before they even begin, and it is not because the strategy is complicated. It is because the strategy demands something they are not willing to build. Discipline, debt used without discipline, is a blade held by the blindfolded. It will cut the one holding it before it cuts anything else. This is precisely why the majority of financial advice defaults to blanket avoidance. It is easier to tell an undisciplined population to avoid a weapon entirely than to teach them how to wield it responsibly. But you are not building your life around the majority. You are building around mastery. Before you ever take on debt as a strategy rather than a habit, you must first prove to yourself that you can control your own impulses. Can you resist the urge to spend the moment access to capital appears? Can you separate the feeling of having money available from the discipline of only deploying toward assets that pay you back? If the answer is no, debt will destroy you exactly as the warnings promised. If the answer is yes, debt becomes the fastest lever you have ever pulled. This is the filter the wealthy pass through quietly, long before they ever take their first large loan. They practice restraint on small amounts before they are ever trusted by banks or by themselves with large ones. Lesson 4. Other people's money is the real currency of power. Here is a truth that will feel uncomfortable the first time you hear it. Your own savings will almost never be enough to build real wealth on their own. Not because you don't earn enough. Because capital accumulated one paycheck at a time moves too slowly to outrun inflation, opportunity costs, and time itself. This is why the wealthy rarely build empires using only their own money. They use what strategists have called for centuries the resources of others. Borrowed capital, investor capital, bank capital, partner capital. Machiavelli knew that a prince who commands only his own army is limited by the size of his own kingdom. But a prince who can command allied forces, borrowed forces, expands his reach far beyond his personal resources. Translate this into modern terms and the principle barely changes. A property purchase using a mortgage allows you to control an asset worth far more than your own capital could purchase outright, while someone else, often a tenant, repays that debt on your behalf. A business funded partially through a loan allows you to generate revenue on infrastructure you could not have built with savings alone. In both cases, you are not the only one financing your future. You have recruited outside capital to fight on your behalf. The poor are taught to see this as risk. The wealthy see it as recruitment. Lesson 5. Build the guardrails before you build an empire. None of this works without structure, and this is the part the loudest voices online conveniently skip. Because structure is boring and boring does not go viral. But structure is exactly what separates the strategist from the gambler. Before using debt as leverage, the disciplined mind builds 3 guardrails. First, never borrow against something that does not have a clear plan to pay for itself. If the asset cannot realistically generate income or appreciate in value, the debt behind it is consumption wearing a costume. Second, never let monthly obligations exceed what your current base income can absorb without depending on projected future income that has not yet arrived. Hope is not a repayment plan. Third, always maintain a reserve, untouched, separate, protected, so that a single disruption cannot collapse the entire structure. The wealthy do not eliminate risk. They isolate it, so that one bad quarter cannot become one ruined decade. These guardrails are not exciting. They will never trend. But they are the difference between a man who uses debt to build an empire and the man who uses debt to build a coffin. Lesson 6. The psychology of the untouchable borrower. There is a strange transformation that happens once someone begins using debt correctly. They stop feeling owned by their obligations and start feeling armed by them. This shift is entirely psychological before it becomes financial. The undisciplined borrower feels the weight of every payment as a threat, a countdown, a leash pulling tighter each month. The disciplined borrower feels each payment as a scheduled transaction inside a system they built on purpose, with the outcome already calculated in advance. This is why two people can carry the same monthly debt obligation and experience in completely opposite emotional worlds. One lies awake at night, terrified. The other checks a spreadsheet, adjusts a variable, and goes back to sleep. The difference was never the number. The difference was whether the debt was chosen with strategy or fallen into through desperation. Machiavelli never promised that power would feel comfortable to those unprepared for it. He simply revealed how it actually works. And this principle of leverage is no different. It rewards those who approach it with clear eyes, and it punishes those who approach it wounded, desperate, or blind. Lesson 7. The compounding of command. There's a quiet mathematics behind why the wealthy grow wealthier at a pace that seems almost unfair, and it has nothing to do with luck. It has to do with what happens when leverage is repeated over time instead of used once and abandoned. Picture the young man who takes his first calculated loan and buys his first income-producing asset. In year one, the gain looks modest. A small property, a small margin, barely enough to feel like a victory. But he does not stop there. He takes the equity generated by that first asset, still borrowed capital in disguise, and uses it as a foundation for a second acquisition, then a third. Each new position is partly funded by the performance of the one before it. This is not simply addition. This is compounding. The same force that quietly builds fortunes in markets, now applied to the deliberate use of debt as a repeated tool rather than a single event. The undisciplined man, by contrast, takes on debt once, gets burned by his own lack of a plan, and retreats permanently into the safety of avoidance. He tells the story for the rest of his life as proof that debt is dangerous. He is not wrong that his experience was dangerous. He is wrong about why. It was not the debt that failed him. It was the absence of a second, third, and fourth calculated move that would have turned one risk into a system. Command, in this sense, is not a single decision. It is a discipline repeated until it becomes identity. Machiavelli understood the same pattern in war. The prince who wins one battle and stops is remembered as lucky. The prince who wins battle after battle, using the same principle each time, is remembered as a conqueror. Lesson 8. Protecting the position you have built. Every strategist eventually learns a lesson that arrives later than the others, but matters just as much. Building leverage is only half the game. Protecting it from collapse is the other half, and it is the half most content on this subject ignores entirely, because it is far less exciting to talk about. Interest rates move, markets shift, tenants default, businesses face quarters nobody could have predicted. The wealthy do not pretend these risks do not exist. They plan for them with the same seriousness a general plans for an ambush. This means never structuring debts so tightly that a single disruption becomes an extinction event. It means understanding the terms of every loan taken, not glancing past them in the excitement of acquisition. It means separating personal exposure from business exposure wherever legally possible, so that a failure in one venture does not drag down an entire life's work. Machiavelli warned that fortune is like a violent river, and the wise man builds defenses before the flood arrives, not during it. This is precisely what separates those who use debt for a decade of expansion from those who use it for a single dramatic collapse that becomes a cautionary tale told at dinner parties for the rest of their lives. The tool was never the problem in either story. The presence or absence of foresight was. There's an old kind of story worth telling here, not because it is factual, but because it captures something factual data alone cannot. Picture two young men working the same modest job in the same modest city, both offered in the same year an identical opportunity to acquire a small rental property using borrowed capital far larger than either of their savings. The first young man refused. He had been raised on warnings. He had watched a relative struggle under reckless debt and swore, quietly and firmly, that he would never repeat that mistake. He kept working. He kept saving. He was, by every surface measure, the responsible one. The second young man accepted, but not blindly. He spent weeks studying the numbers before signing anything. He calculated the rental income against the loan payment with brutal precision. He built a reserve before he ever moved forward. He treated the decision the way a strategist treats a campaign, not the way a gambler treats a bet. Machiavelli wrote that fortune favors the bold, but he never meant the reckless. He meant the prepared man who moves the instant opportunity appears, because occasion, the moment itself, does not wait for the cautious to feel ready. 5 years passed. The first young man had saved a respectable sum, disciplined and steady, exactly as promised. The second young man had used that first property's equity to acquire a second, then used both to acquire a third, each purchased back by tenants effectively repaying his debt on his behalf, while the properties themselves quietly rose in value around him. Neither man was smarter than the other. Neither man worked harder in the traditional sense. The difference was not effort. The difference was that one of them understood the difference between a weapon and a wound, and used the exact instrument the other had been taught since childhood to fear. Lesson 9. The founder who borrowed to build. Everything said so far has leaned heavily on property, because property is the clearest illustration of the principle. But the same law governs a founder building a business from nothing, and the story deserves its own telling. Picture a young founder with a genuinely useful idea and almost no capital of his own. He could wait years, saving slowly from a job unrelated to his ambition, hoping to eventually self-fund the equipment, the inventory, the first hires his idea requires. By the time he had saved enough through that path, the market opportunity he originally spotted would likely belong to someone else entirely. Someone who moved while he was still accumulating permission to begin. Instead, he does something the frightened version of himself would never have considered. He studies the numbers with total honesty, projects revenue with deliberate conservatism rather than optimism, and takes a modest loan size specifically to fund equipment or inventory his business needs to start generating income immediately, not eventually. He does not use borrowed capital to pay himself a comfortable salary before the business proves itself. He does not use it to rent an impressive office designed to look successful. Every borrowed dollar is deployed directly into whatever produces revenue fastest and most reliably. Within the first year, the business generates enough to service the loan and begin reinvesting in its own growth, a growth that would have taken 3 or 4 additional years to reach through savings alone. The founder did not simply get lucky with timing. He understood that capital borrowed with precision and deployed toward production rather than comfort compresses time in a way that patient saving never can. This is the exact mechanism Machiavelli described in an entirely different context. Borrowed strength, allowing a smaller force to achieve in months what its own resources alone would have required years to accomplish. The founder who avoids this path entirely, waiting instead for the mythical moment when he is saved enough to fund everything himself, is not being cautious. He is quietly gifting his market position to whichever competitor was willing to borrow first. Lesson 10. Timing is not optional. There is a season for expansion and a season for retreat, and confusing the two has ended more fortunes than reckless borrowing ever has on its own. Machiavelli understood that even the boldest prince must read the moment correctly, because the same aggressive move that wins a kingdom in one era loses it in another. The disciplined borrower studies the environment before committing capital. They ask what the cost of borrowing is right now compared to what it has been historically. They ask whether the asset they intend to acquire is priced with room to grow, or already inflated by a crowd chasing the same idea. They ask what happens to their structure if conditions worsen for a year, or 2, or 3, because fortune rarely announces in advance how long a storm will last. This is why identical strategies produce different results depending purely on when they were executed. The same leveraged purchase that built one man's fortune in a favorable decade would have buried another man attempting it blindly during a collapse. The tool did not change. The timing did, and timing is learned only by those willing to study the cycle rather than simply copy the headline. Lesson 11. The final test of character. Strip away every technical detail, and you arrive at something almost uncomfortably simple. Debt does not create character. It reveals it instantly and without mercy. Give a reckless man access to capital, and he will show you exactly who he was all along, simply faster and with larger numbers attached. Give a disciplined man that same access, and he will show you the opposite, a steady hand moving deliberately toward outcomes he has already calculated in advance. The instrument is identical in both hands. The result could not be more different. This is precisely why the old warnings persist. It is far easier to tell an entire population to avoid the test altogether than prepare each person individually to pass it. Blanket avoidance is a mercy for the unprepared and a cage for everyone else. The strategist does not accept the cage simply because it was built with good intentions. The strategist asks a harder question first. Have I actually built the character this weapon requires? Or am I still the reckless version of myself the warning was designed for? Only once that question has an honest answer does the real strategy begin. Every strategist has faced the same 3 objections, and it is worth confronting them directly rather than pretending they don't exist. The first objection sounds like this. What about 2008? What about every story of leveraged investors wiped out when markets collapsed overnight? This objection is real, and it deserves respect rather than dismissal. But look closer at who actually survived that collapse and who did not. The investors destroyed in that crisis were, almost without exception, the ones who ignored every guardrail already outlined here. They borrowed against assets with no cushion for a downturn. They assumed prices would rise forever. They mistook a favorable season for a permanent law of nature. The investors who survived, and many who quietly grew wealthier in the years that followed by acquiring discounted assets from the panic of others, were the ones who had built reserves, avoided overextension, and treated leverage as a discipline rather than a party trick. The crisis did not punish debt. It punished the absence of a plan. The second objection sounds like this. I don't have good credit, so none of this applies to me. Understand something important here. Credit is not a fixed trait you were born with. It is a track record, built one small decision at a time, and it can be rebuilt the same way it was damaged, deliberately and patiently. The strategist who currently lacks access to large capital does not abandon the principle. They begin smaller. A small, responsible line of credit used and repaid on time. A small loan for a modest asset, proven reliable before a larger one is ever requested. Trust, whether from a bank or from yourself, is earned in increments, never handed over in full on the first attempt. Machiavelli understood this precisely when he wrote about newly acquired territory, that a new prince must move carefully to earn the trust an established ruler already holds. You are not owed the terms given to those with decades of proven reliability. You earn them the same way every prince before you earn his throne, one demonstrated victory at a time. The third objection sounds like this. This sounds like something only available to people who already have money. This is, ironically, the exact fear this entire lesson was designed to dismantle. Yes, those who already hold assets are offered more favorable terms, because trust compounds the same way capital does. But the starting point for every wealthy family that did not inherit its position was identical to yours. A first small step, a first modest loan, a first calculated risk taken before there was any safety net beneath it. The gap you see today between where you stand and where they stand was not decided at birth. It was decided by who was willing to walk through the gate first. Lesson 12. What you pass down is a system, not a warning. There is a final layer to this that most people never reach, because most people never build enough leverage to think this far ahead. Consider what actually gets inherited across generations in a family that never questions a fear of debt, compared to a family that mastered it. The first family passes down the warning itself. Be careful. Avoid loans. Say what you can. It is passed down with love, with genuine good intention, and it produces exactly what was designed to produce: another generation of careful, cautious people standing in roughly the same financial position their parents occupied, sometimes slightly better, rarely dramatically different. The second family passes down something else entirely, not just assets, though they're usually assets. They pass down the actual mechanics, the guardrails, the discipline required to use borrowed capital as a weapon rather than a trap. A child raised watching a parent calculate leverage with precision inherits an instinct that no amount of inherited cash alone could replicate. Give the first family's descendant a fortune with no understanding of how it was built, and it tends to evaporate within a generation or two. A pattern observed so consistently across history has become almost proverbial. Give the second family's descendant nothing but the mechanics, and they tend to rebuild a version of the same position their parents held, because the system was inherited, not merely the money. This is the real distinction between a fortune and a legacy. A fortune is a number. A legacy is a method that keeps working long after the person who first proved it is gone. Machiavelli understood that a prince obsessed only with the treasure he currently holds will lose it eventually, while a prince who builds durable systems of power creates something that survives him. He also noted that hereditary principalities are far easier to hold than newly built ones, precisely because the mechanics of rule have already been absorbed by those who inherit them. Wealth works the same way. The family that inherits the method, not merely the money, holds its position away an established house, holds its throne. The same is true here, quietly, inside ordinary families making ordinary decisions about ordinary loans, decade after decade, without ever using the word legacy out loud. You were handed a fence and told it was a wall built to protect you. It was never built to protect you. It was built to contain you, to keep you circling the same small pasture, while others, unafraid of the exact tool you were warned against, expanded their territory using resources that were never even theirs to begin with. This does not mean charge blindly into every loan offered to you. Recklessness was never the lesson. Recklessness is simply fear's twin, dressed differently, still capable of destroying you just as completely. A man who borrows without a plan and a man who never borrows at all will often end up standing in the exact same field, still small, still waiting, still telling themselves a story about why nothing changed. The lesson is precision. Know the difference between debt that buys a feeling and debt that buys a future. Know your own discipline before you ever test it against real capital. Build your guardrails before you build your empire. Study timing the way a general studies weather before a march. And once you understand the difference, stop apologizing for using a tool that has quietly built more fortunes across history than caution ever has. Understand also that this knowledge does not end the moment the video ends. The men and women who actually use this correctly did not learn it in a single sitting. They returned to these principles again and again, testing them against small decisions before ever trusting them with large ones, refining their guardrails after every mistake instead of retreating the first time discomfort appeared. That repetition, more than any single insight, is what eventually separates the strategist from the spectator. Think back to the first man and the second man from earlier, the one who saved cautiously and the one who studied leverage. Neither of them was a villain in this story. Neither of them was a fool. They simply inherited different instructions, and those instructions, compounded quietly over 10 years, produced two entirely different lives. That is the real way to what has been said here. It was never really about debt. Debt was only ever the visible symbol. The actual subject was instruction, the quiet inherited beliefs that shape which tools you consider available to you and which tools you're taught to walk past without ever picking up. You do not have to take on debt tomorrow. You do not have to reject every warning you were ever given. What you owe yourself, if nothing else, is the honesty to separate a warning that was designed to protect you from a warning that was designed to contain you, and to finally decide, with clear eyes and steady hand, which one you have actually been living under all along. If this video shifted the way you see debt, don't just scroll past it. Like this video, drop a comment telling me which strategy hit you the hardest, and subscribe, because every video on this channel is built to sharpen your mind and separate you from the crowd that stays comfortable. No fluff, no noise, just doctrine. Most people that lose this game, they just never played it.